Hi everyone, this is Jikai Dehn of the Enmitsuji Tendai Temple, helping you to become the potent advocate for Dharma that the Buddha calls us to be. Today we'll be touching on the significance of lineage, the roles it plays in Buddha-Dharma in the broadest sense, and what it is doing in the Tiantai and Tendai tradition more specifically. Such questions are vitally important, but their importance is matched by the level of confusion that can be caused when we ask such questions without a sufficiently wide lens. In this video, hopefully we'll be able to clear up some of this confusion, as well as offer you some tips on how to think of lineage more broadly. It's probably no exaggeration to say that the concept of lineage in Buddhism has been important since Shakyamuni manifested his parinirvana in approximately 480 BC. Lineage has effectively always been important then, in a way that is perhaps unique to this faith tradition. Having as it does the narrative of a human being at its core, Buddhists to this day claim not divine but rather human authority, specifically via the person of the Buddha. And so being able to demonstrate one's lineage is equivalent to demonstrating that the integrity of the Buddha's teaching has been preserved intact as it was transmitted from one generation to the next. On the micro scale, in theory, lineage ensures that what the student is receiving is more than merely their teacher's best guess, but is traceable to a line of realized masters stretching back through time. Given this role of lineage, it's perhaps not surprising to learn that the earliest schools and lineage statements are Vinaya lineages. In other words, showing that one's Vinaya lineage is legitimate constitutes proof that one's ordination and Sangha status has been confirmed and conforms to the broader community standards. The Chinese Vinaya specialist Sun You writes the following in the preface to his now lost work outlining the lineage of the Sarvastivada school in approximately 500 AD. The era in which the great sage's radiance coursed in the world has long passed. That the Dharma and Sangha have not also been lost is due solely to the Vinaya. When the Vinaya Pitaka was initially collated, this singular standard was studied in common by all. In the middle period, however, it was upheld differently, and the 5 versions of the Vinaya each separated from each other. From this split into 5 versions, each then practiced in accord with what they received from their master. And it is only the Sarvastivada version which has been cultivated in the land of Qi, i.e. China. This originated in Sindhu, or India, and then spread to Kashmir, such that its earlier sages and later noble ones both shone luminously. Their virtues raised them up to the stages of the bodhisattvas, or they realized the fruits of the Shravakas. Some demonstrated signs and revealed portents. Others concealed their tracks and seemed like ordinary people. In all cases they held firm to the regulations of the Vinaya, and so they laid bare the transformativity of the Dharma. The old records mention 53 such individuals, and from these individuals onwards, wise ones have continued to appear, who likewise inherit the excellence of the ancients and extend their line to the present. In the final age, the 5 kinds of disciple are to rely on these teachings, so that the tradition remains a light and can be clearly sought. One who sits in the shade of a tree protects that tree's roots, and one who drinks from the spring preserves its font. How could we then take to heart these profound instructions and yet not record the line of these individuals? In other words, although the light of the Buddha's presence has passed beyond the horizon, a lineage may still transmit its radiance such that former sages and later noble ones shine equally bright if they maintain the integrity of their Vinaya or ordination lineage. This depicts lineage, broadly speaking, as a continuation of behaviour and quite literally as a harmony of conduct between former and later links. As Buddhism moved outside of India, the necessity to demonstrate a connection with the earlier members of the tradition naturally only grew in importance. Early Chinese masters, such as the Madhyamaka Jizang, critiqued their opponents on their inability to demonstrate a tangible fidelity to the lines of doctrinal transmission as well. For example, in his treatise on the profundity of the great vehicle, he says the following about an interlocutor. However, he lacked the necessary teacher-student transmission, and the core of one's study must be based on the transmission from one's teacher. In other words, if one could not at least demonstrate this kind of doctrinal transmission, then their positions were mere opinion. Sung Yao and Jizang's remarks give us a very tangible and concrete picture of the fundamental role of lineage within the East Asian context. All Buddhist schools, especially those that wanted to be taken seriously outside of India, needed to address questions of lineage in a meaningful fashion, and anyone who chose not to engage with these questions appropriately was at risk of not even requiring refutation. Lineage, therefore, very clearly connects one with the Buddha. But is this all that lineage intends to achieve? Even in Sung Yao's lineage statement, we can already see the admission that lineage does more than merely connect one with the Buddha, for he says, from this split into 5 versions, each then practice in accord with what they received from their master. After all, Sung Yao is writing this in the service of the Sarvastivada line specifically, not more broadly as a Buddhist. Elizabeth Morrison puts her finger on the issue of treating lineage as nothing more than a connection with the Buddha when she says the following in her book, The Power of the Patriarchs. And because every officially ordained monastic belonged to this ordination lineage, it offered no means of distinguishing oneself or one's particular form of Buddhist philosophy or practice. To understand what she's getting at concretely, let us use an example to illustrate the problem. A Madhyamaka and a Yogacharan in China could both be ordained within the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya lineage. This would make the ordination of each of these monastics equally legitimate, as both of them have been initiated into an accepted monastic line. But this has nothing whatever to do with the particular practices and doctrines which each of these monastics might have held or engaged in. And given that the practices and doctrines which one upholds are for all intents and purposes the tangible manifestation of the doctrine that one has received from their teacher, lineage takes on a second and no less necessary role, namely to represent the transmission of the specific doctrines and peculiar practices that have coalesced around a particular line of masters. This is what we would plainly call a school or sect lineage. In short, one's lineage connects them not only to the person of the Buddha, but also to distinct elements of Buddha-Dharma valued above others and determined by a respective line of masters in which one has received the transmission. The 2 primary purposes of lineage, therefore, are 1, to connect the individual with the person of the Buddha, and 2, to legitimize the set of doctrinal teachings and contemplative practices that have developed within a distinct line of transmission. The first relates to one's legitimacy as a Buddhist, and the second to one's legitimacy within a specific sectarian or school affiliation. Both of these elements are crucial, therefore, to a broader understanding of lineage within Buddhism, and any approach that does not have an eye, respectively, to these 2 ends is at risk of confusing or conflating the 2 and achieving neither. When we consider questions of lineage, then, we must always be asking, is this lineage statement intended to fulfill both of these requirements or only one? Frustration can occur when we assume that a single lineage statement must fulfill both of these, or when we've lost sight of one of them. We must further consider whether or not the doctrinal claims specific to a school impact the way that they understand their connection with the Buddha. For example, is the only way to connect someone with the person of the Buddha to draw a straight line between the Buddha and later masters? Or are there other ways of showing this connection and thereby claiming that legitimacy? Now Now that we've laid out the fundamental roles of lineage in the broadest sense, we can begin to look at the lineage within the Tiantai Tendai tradition specifically. The earliest proper lineage statement in the Tiantai tradition is the one written by Master Guanding as part of his introduction to Great Master Zhiyi's magnum opus, the Mohe Zhiguan, or Great Calming and Contemplation. Guanding explains his reasoning for adding a genealogy to this text in the following way. When the practitioner hears the transmission of the treasury of the Dharma, then he will know our forebears and sources. Guanding then proceeds to set out a line of transmission which begins with the Buddha himself and then continues through 24 Indian monastics spanning 23 generations. Our tradition refers to this line of Indian masters as the transmission from the Golden Mouth, precisely because it proceeds from the very mouth of the Buddha himself. Now, Master Guanding did not come up with this list on his own, but rather takes it directly from a text known as the Record of the Conditions for the Transmission of the Treasury of the Dharma, translated by Kinkara and Tanyao in 472 AD. He admits this openly because, as we saw, he opens his lineage statement by mentioning the name of the text explicitly. While there are many names on this list, the primary ones that we need to pay attention to are those I've coloured in blue. That is, the Buddha himself, the 13th Patriarch Nagarjuna, and the 23rd Patriarch Simha. To begin with, let's take a quick look at the last of these highlighted individuals, that is the Indian monastic named Simha. Being the last Indian link in this transmission from the Golden Mouth, we might expect to see Master Guanding connecting the Venerable Simha with some Chinese master who will eventually bring us down to Master Zhiyi himself. But when we read Master Guanding's description of Simha, we find something rather unusual in the telling. Haklenayashas transmitted the Dharma to Simha. This Simha was killed by King Damila, and when the sword sliced his head off, milk flowed out. The men who transmitted the treasury of the Dharma, beginning with Mahakashapa and ending with Simha, were 23 persons in all. Madhyantika also received it at the same time as Shanavasa, and so there are 24 individuals in total. These various masters are all recorded as those of the Golden Mouth transmission. Together they were the noble ones, able to greatly benefit the multitudes. In other words, Master Guanding tells us that the last member of this line, an Indian monk named Simha, was killed at the hands of a king named Damila, and thus ended the transmission from the Golden Mouth. When we turn to the text that Guanding is working from, we find that Master Guanding is not making this detail up either, for there we read the following version. There was then a bhikshu named Simha, who extensively worked in the Buddha's cause in Kashmir. At that time, the king of that country was named Damila. He allowed wrong views to flourish, and his heart was without reverence and faith in the Buddha-Dharma. In the country of Kashmir, he destroyed stupas and temples, and slaughtered myriad monastics. To wit, he took a sharp sword and used it to cut down Simha. From his neck gushed no blood, but only milk, and so the line of individuals who successively transmitted the Dharma was thereby severed. Not only does this source confirm Guanding's account, it makes unambiguously clear that at the death of Master Simha, this patriarchal transmission was ended. It might strike us as rather unusual that Master Guanding would use a lineage like this to build a case for the legitimacy of his own master, Master Zhiyi. After all, we saw that one of the roles of lineage is to link one with the person of the Buddha. And yet, in both the original text and Guanding's retelling, there is a detailed symbolism which is hard to discount when you see it. Both versions tell us that when Simha was beheaded, not blood but milk flowed out. This symbolism is supposed to strike the ear as unusual, because we all know that if someone is beheaded, a great deal of blood will naturally flow forth. By stating otherwise, both accounts intend to highlight not the death and loss of blood per se, but that this represents the dispersion of the milk of Dharma, literally spilt milk. So the implication is pointedly that the milk of Dharma has here been spilled. And if this is so, then Master Simha was not able to pass on this milk of the Dharma to a disciple, like pouring milk from one vessel to another. And this is why both the original source and Guanding make very plain that the transmission ends here. Unlike the original source, which essentially ends there, Guanding continues with a second lineage, and this line has been known since Master Janran's time as the transmission from a present master, in order to draw a distinction between this one and the previous lineage. In contradistinction to our first lineage, which works forward in time from the earliest member of the Buddha to the latest being Simha, this second lineage starts with Master Zhiyi in the present and works backwards. Perhaps here we'll find a connection with that first lineage of the Golden Mouth. Guanding lays it out as follows. In this treatise on calming and contemplation, Tiantai Zhizhe, i.e. Zhiyi, expounds the Dharma gate which he cultivated in his own mind. When Zhizhe was born, light filled the room and double pupils appeared in his eyes. He cultivated the repentance of the Dharma Flower Sutra, generating Dharani, and he lectured upon the golden-leaded Prajnaparamita Sutra in the place of his master Huisi. The two states of the Chen and Sui exalted him as the imperial teacher, and he passed while in meditation, abiding in the fifth stage of a disciple. Zhizhe waited upon his master Nanyue Huisi, for Nanyue Huisi's virtuous cultivation was beyond conception or discussion. He exclusively recited texts for 10 years, practiced the repentance of the Vaipulya for 7 years, and constantly sat for 3 months, attaining perfect realization in an instant. He clearly penetrated and realized the Dharma gates of the great and lesser vehicle. Nanyue Huisi waited upon his dhyana master Huiwen, who walked alone in the area of the Yellow and Huai rivers during the time of Gaozu of the Qi dynasty. His Dharma gates were not known during his time, for walking upon the earth they knew not its depth, and gazing at the heavens knew not its height. Master Huiwen relied exclusively on the Mahaprajnaparamita Upadesha for his mental discipline, which is a treatise expounded by Nagarjuna, the 13th master in the transmission of the treasury of the Dharma. In his treatise on contemplation of thought, Zhizhe says, "I take refuge in Master Nagarjuna." From this we know that Nagarjuna is the supreme patriarch of our school. Now there's a lot to unpack here, but let's focus on the important details. First, let us look at the lineage that Guanding has just outlined. We have 3 Chinese masters which culminate with the official school founder, Master Zhiyi. The only Indian figure explicitly mentioned in this lineage is Master Nagarjuna, who we saw was the 13th patriarch on the transmission from the Golden Mouth. A quick look at the dates of Masters Nagarjuna and Huiwen, however, make abundantly clear that the two individuals could not have shared a face-to-face teacher-student relationship, and this is to say nothing of the vast distance in space between southern India, where Nagarjuna lived, and central China, where Huiwen spent his life. But Guanding makes no attempt to argue otherwise. In fact, he explicitly said that Huiwen relied exclusively on the Mahaprajnaparamita Upadesha, which is a treatise expounded by Nagarjuna. If you're confused by all of this, you wouldn't be the first. Current English language scholarship on this lineage statement creates more confusion than clarification to boot. Doesn't Master Guanding know how a lineage is supposed to work? Surely this is some kind of careless mistake. Maybe he got the dates confused. Maybe he didn't realize how all of this sounded. But surely, if all of this was a mistake, then later Tiantai and Tendai masters would have quickly rectified the error. Except instead of this, we see Master Janran saying the following in his commentary. The transmission from the Golden Mouth goes from first to last, while this transmission from a present master goes from last to first. This is in order to highlight that which Master Huiwen received from Nagarjuna was directly from a text. In other words, Master Janran says that the whole reason that Guanding has this second lineage proceeding in the opposite direction to the first is precisely because he wants our eye to be drawn to the fact that Hui Wen's relationship with Nagarjuna is through a text and not face-to-face. Dengyo Daishi Saicho, the founder of Japanese Tendai, would later go on to say the following in his verses on the transmission of the Tendai Hokkeshu. This sublime Dharma Flower Sutra, the 500 verses of the Madhyamaka Shastra, together with the Mahaprajna Paramita Upadesha, were translated by the Tripitaka Acharya Kumara Jiva. Dhyana Master Hui Wen of the Northern Chi read the translation of this sutra and these treatises, and because he cultivated as they expounded, he attained the meaning within the text. So following on from Master Guanding and Master Janran, Master Saicho makes it even clearer that the relationship is textual by highlighting that Kumara Jiva is the translator of Nagarjuna's text, and again that it is through this that Master Hui Wen attained realization. Sometime during the Middle Ages, the Master Zunshi says the following. He grasped Nagarjuna's text on the three knowledges in a single thought, and on the basis of this treatise established his contemplative practices. It is from this that he personally attained awakening, so how could it be said that he didn't have a teacher? So Zunshi's genius way of highlighting that the relationship between Nagarjuna and Hui Wen is textual rather than face-to-face is to highlight that he used a text and then ask the rhetorical question of whether there is a difference between a teacher's words in written form or their oral form in face-to-face instruction. In 1237 AD, Zongjian says the following, and so it indicates that the distant Nagarjuna is his master. That is, though he did not know Nagarjuna's face, he had already discerned Nagarjuna's mind. So this follows on from the implications of Zunshi's remarks by asking us to consider whether what we mean when we say that someone has a teacher is that they've done something rather mundane like seeing a person's face or body, or do we really mean that one has seen a teacher's mind? And finally, sometime between 1220 and 1275, Zhipan says the following. The Venerable Hui Wen of the Northern Chi relied on his own inherent endowments and did not require the in-person transmission from a teacher. He simultaneously awakened to Nagarjuna's teaching of the identity of emptiness, the identity of the provisional, and the identity of the middle. In Zhipan, then, the text itself, as the vehicle of transmission, is not even mentioned. Instead, Zhipan speaks in the negative and says that the one thing he didn't have was an in-person transmission. Bringing all of this together, if the severing of the transmission of the Golden Mouth with Simha's execution, or if the textual relationship between Hui Wen and Nagarjuna, which kickstarts the transmission from a present master, shook the confidence or concerned these men at all, then they show absolutely no sign of it. In fact, they repeat this claim time and time again over many centuries as a clarion call for their tradition. This theme is therefore very intentionally being offered up. This is no mistake. And yet, if you read the majority of English language scholarship on this lineage, you'll get the distinct impression that it somehow needs to be explained away. For example, you'll see numerous attempts of varying ingenuity to draw a link between the two lines in the person of Nagarjuna. Or even better, you'll get the impression that this model proves that our conceptions of lineage as a chain linking a patriarch all the way back to the Buddha himself comes later, and that herein we have the proof, perhaps, that such conceptions of lineage were not always crucial. Multiple papers have been written on how this lineage statement was designed to maintain control of monasteries on Mount Tiantai, and whole careers have been made by trying to show that the Chan or Zen lineage statements, in contradistinction to this one, represent a fuller appreciation or development of the significance of unbroken lines of transmission. And finally, others have alternatively suggested that Guanding's appropriation of a severed lineage is supposed to constitute a critique of imperial interference with the Buddhist establishment. But if Guanding's introduction to the Mohe had as one of its primary aims securing control of certain temple compounds, why wouldn't his focus have been to draw direct reference to the authority bestowed upon Zhiyi's living disciples, which includes himself? Instead, we find he makes no mention of them at all. And if the idea of unbroken lines of transmission properly developed later, why were the majority of the early Indian schools represented by ordination lineages which transmitted the light of the Buddha undimmed across time? Was Guanding somehow unaware of Sun Yol's statement on such matters approximately 50 years before he was born? And why would the later Tiantai Tendai prelates we looked at, who certainly did live in environments where this string of pearl type lineage had come into vogue, all try so poorly to rectify this apparent threat to their lineage authority? What's more, if Guanding and later Tiantai and Tendai Buddhists wanted so deeply to warn against the consequences of government persecution on the Buddha-Dharma's vitality, why doesn't any of the exegesis of this lineage statement ever make reference to the persecution experienced under former dynasties? After all, anyone who knows anything about Chinese history knows that the easiest way to get on the good side of a presiding dynasty was to badmouth the one they overthrew. All of these scholarly attempts to explain the unique features of this lineage statement are wanting. Perhaps it's time for us to return to the purposes of lineage that we discussed at the very beginning of this video. You'll remember that we broadly laid out the following. That is, 1, that a lineage connects an individual with the Buddha, and 2, that a lineage legitimizes the set of doctrinal teachings and contemplative practices that have developed within a distinct line of masters. Starting with the first one, we might ask the obvious. Why was Guanding not worried about showing that Master Zhiyi had a direct, unbroken connection to the Buddha? Perhaps the answer is just as obvious as the question. That is, he was not concerned with doing this here, because elsewhere he goes to the trouble of mentioning that Master Zhiyi trained with a number of masters. For example, in his biography, he tells us that Zhiyi first trained with the Shramana Fasyu in approximately 555 AD. He then went to Mount Dacian, where he trained with the Vinaya master Hui Guang in approximately 555 AD. And it's only then that Zhiyi goes to Mount Dasu, where he trains with the Dhyana master Huisi in approximately 560 AD. Given that Master Guanding goes to the effort in 605 AD with Zhiyi's biography to show explicitly that his connection to the Buddha and legitimate channels of ordination was amply satisfied, it makes perfect sense that here in this introduction to the Mohe he felt it unnecessary to do it again. After all, I shouldn't be the first person to notice that while Zhiyi's biography was completed in 605 AD, this introduction to the Mohe was completed at earliest in 607 and at latest by 632 AD. Indeed, within this very introduction, Guanding makes clear that Master Zhiyi was honoured by 2 dynasties as the imperial instructor. If this is not ample evidence to show that Master Zhiyi's legitimacy as a representative of the Buddha was not in question, then I have no idea what type of evidence we would hope for. Now, it needs to be said plainly and clearly here that just because this is not Guanding's purpose here in the introduction to the Mohe this in no way, shape or form means that the Tiantai Tendai tradition does not think it's important or necessary to establish oneself within the line of the Buddha. Our tradition places just as much emphasis and importance on this kind of lineage as any other school. But nonetheless, we must go back to the drawing board and look elsewhere for the purpose of this lineage statement in the Mohe. Perhaps then, there is a certain doctrine or elements of practice which Zhiyi expounded, and it's these that need to be accounted for with this lineage statement instead. The late Dr. Penkower, for example, certainly thought that this might explain Guanding's aims and said the following to this effect. This is a profoundly religious pronouncement, and Guanding's twofold genealogy, with its textually oriented Western line and its self-awakened line of Eastern contemplatives, is at its heart a metaphor for the dynamic interplay between received and inspired tradition that is subsumed under the two-pronged agenda established by Zhiyi of doctrinal learning and meditative praxis. In other words, Penkower notes that Hui Wen contemplated Nagarjuna's text of the Mahaprajnaparamita Upadesha, and by practicing upon it, this Chinese master attained awakening. She also notes that in Zhiyi's biography and in his own works, Master Huisi is known to have cultivated based upon and attained awakening via the text of the Lotus Sutra. For example, in the biography, we hear the following. In his heart, Master Huisi thought of himself, saying, I have upheld the Dharma Flower Sutra in the Dharma-ending age of Shakyamuni Buddha. I have now encountered the merciful honoured one, i.e. Maitreya Buddha, and have been moved to tears, for I have suddenly awakened. Huisi himself says the following of the Lotus Sutra in his The Meaning of the Dharma Flower Sutra's Cultivation of Peace and Bliss. The Dharma Flower Sutra is the sudden awakening of the Mahayana. It is spontaneous realization without a teacher. It is the swift attainment of the way of the Buddhas, and is the Dharma gate which all the world finds difficult to believe. Bringing all of this together, Penkower suspects that the Indian line of patriarchs, starting with the Shakyamuni Buddha himself and passing through the 13th master Nagarjuna, represents the doctrinal and textual components of the Buddhist path, while the Chinese line, starting with Hui Wen and passing through Huisi, is representative of the contemplative and practice component of Buddha-Dharma. With this basic operating theory, she sees Master Zhiyi as the inheritor of both of these lineage lines, and this is why she suspects that Master Zhiyi and the Tiantai Tendai tradition more broadly comes to place great emphasis on the balancing of both study and practice. In other words, Penkower believes that the reason for Guanding's unusual description of two disconnected lineages is primarily to show the unification of these two lines that occurred in the person of Master Zhiyi. This would mean that Master Guanding's lineage is not designed to make a direct connection with the Buddha per se, but that it hopes to fulfill the second purpose of lineage we talked about, i.e., to legitimize the set of doctrinal teachings and contemplative practices that developed within this distinct line of transmission and were exemplified in the person of Master Zhiyi. Elizabeth Morrison concurs with Penkower's reading of these lineages as offering legitimacy to Master Zhiyi and his doctrinal positions, for in her book she says the following. What is clear is that Guanding, in composing a lineage claim for his teacher, defines it as Penkower has demonstrated in terms of a balance between learning and meditation. The role of lineage in this case is not only to demonstrate authority, but to express the teaching backed by that authority. Now, admittedly, this is an interesting interpretation, and it certainly goes much further towards getting at Guanding's intentions than those accounts which try to explain away the abrupt severing of the first lineage and the textual start of the second. But, unfortunately, this conclusion can't possibly be right either, because it violates rather than preserves a number of obvious details in Guanding's lineage statement. For example, if the Chinese lineage is representative of praxis, while the Indian lineage is representative of doxis, this theory actually sets up three lineages, because Master Zhiyi has to be separated out from this Chinese lineage tendency in an important sense. Leaving that issue aside and looking at the Indian lineage, if the Buddha himself and the greatest sage of the Mahayana, Nagarjuna, are both typified as representing the doctrinal thread of this picture, why does Guanding in this very same introduction say the following about the Buddha? The greatly awakened world-honoured one completed the practices over eons. Wandering for 6 years, he subdued wrong views and overcame Mara by raising a single finger. It seems from this not only that the first thing that Guanding praises the Buddha for is his completion of practice over many eons, but also that he wants to suggest that the Buddha perfected his understanding of doctrine in overcoming wrong views. And if this is merely a case of Guanding's careless choice of words, why does Zhipan concur with his understanding when he speaks of Master Zhiyi in the following way? 智者, i.e. Zhiyi, utilize them, awakened to the Dharma Flower Sutra, and subsequently re-established the profound undertaking which we refer to as our school. Now, the obvious fact looking back at us from the page is that something cannot be re-established if it didn't exist before. If Master Guanding then really intended to establish a Western or Indian line typified by doctrine and an Eastern or Chinese line typified by practice, and as a result of those two lines to show that the two tendencies of doctrine and practice were uniquely unified in the person of Master Zhiyi, then he appears to be doing an incredibly poor job of it. So poor, in fact, that none of the commentaries I've ever seen suggest anything like this. What's more, this entire interpretation relies on the contradistinction between the Indian or Western line on the one hand and the Chinese or Eastern line on the other. But what is this Chinese or Eastern line that so many scholars seem to be pointing towards? I have to ask the question, are we looking at the same lineage statement? The first lineage was referred to as the transmission from the Golden Mouth, and it was indeed Indian. But the second lineage that Guanding lays out is called the transmission from a present master, and I hope you'll remember that that line of transmission started with Master Nagarjuna. As an Indian, and the all-important link between the two lines, it sounds like he too, with Zhiyi, because he is the balancing of the two tendencies, must be jettisoned from this second line of masters, so that we have a Chinese lineage that is identifiable with practice and an Indian lineage that is identifiable with doctrine. This second line, therefore, has been shortened by 50% from 4 to 2 in order to concur with a theory that apparently reveals its inner modus operandi. If a theory hopes to make sense of a lineage statement, but does this kind of violence to the components of the lineage itself, my humble suggestion to you, dear viewer, is that it is wrong. So what does this leave us with then? It would appear that we've exhausted our two basic rationales for lineage statements and have very little to go on moving forward. But sometimes, my friends, it's only when you've exhausted the versions that everyone keeps repeating time and time again that you can broaden your analytical lens sufficiently to see what has been staring us in the face all along. During our preamble thus far, it might have occurred to you that Master Guanding's lineage statement appears within an introduction that he is writing. Furthermore, this introduction is being appended to a book called the Mohe Zhiguan, or the Great Calming and Contemplation. This Mohe Zhiguan is considered by the tradition to be the magnum opus of Master Zhiyi, and so it's naturally very important to Master Guanding that he gets this introduction right. So important, in fact, that Master Guanding is said to have written 3 versions of it, with the final version that we are looking at appearing sometime between 607 and 632. Given that this introduction appears a number of years after Master Zhiyi has already passed away, and given that we all know good and well that an introduction's usual purpose is to barrack for the text that it is introducing, let us for a moment consider that this might indeed be what Guanding's introduction is trying to do. Now that we're no longer dazzled by the word lineage, let us take another look at the second line of transmission in Guanding's introduction. In this treatise on calming and contemplation, Tiantai Zhizhe, i.e. Zhiyi, expounds a Dharma gate which he cultivated in his own mind. When Zhizhou was born, light filled the room and double pupils appeared in his eyes. He cultivated the repentance of the Dharma Flower Sutra, generating Dharani, and he lectured upon the golden-lettered Prajnaparamita Sutra in the place of his master Huisi. The two states of the Chen and Sui exalted him as the imperial teacher, and he passed while in meditation, abiding in the fifth stage of a disciple. Zhizhou waited upon his master Nanyue Huisi, for Nanyue Huisi's virtuous cultivation was beyond conception or discussion. He exclusively recited texts for 10 years, practiced the repentance of the Vaipulya for 7 years, and constantly sat for 3 months, attaining perfect realization in an instant. He clearly penetrated and realized the Dharma gates of the great and lesser vehicle. Nanyue Huisi waited upon his dhyana master Huiwen, who walked alone in the area of the Yellow and Huai rivers during the time of Gaozu of the Qi dynasty. His Dharma gates were not known during his time, for walking upon the earth they knew not its depth, and gazing at the heavens knew not its height. Master Huiwen relied exclusively on the Mahaprajnaparamita Upadesha for his mental discipline, which is a treatise expounded by Nagarjuna, the 13th master in the transmission of the treasury of the Dharma. And in his treatise on contemplation of thought, Zhizhou says, "I take refuge in Master Nagarjuna." From this, we know that Nagarjuna is the supreme patriarch of our school. Now, the first thing I'd like you to notice is that Guanding starts with a description of Master Zhiyi, but pay close attention to the very first words he says about the man. They refer not to Zhiyi, but his book, in this treatise on calming and contemplation. And this is what Guanding is concerned with, not Zhiyi himself. Master Zhiyi is only introduced to make sense of the book we have in our hands in front of us. Moving to the third sentence in the Chinese, he describes how Master Zhiyi himself attained awakening. He cultivated the repentance of the Dharma Flower Sutra, generating Dharani, and he lectured upon the golden-lettered Prajnaparamita Sutra in the place of his master Huisi. Now, for anyone interested in the symbolism of Zhiyi lecturing in the place of his master, I'd recommend that you look at our video on Buddha Vachana. For now, notice that Master Zhiyi is said to have relied on a book to gain his awakening, namely the Buddha's own magnum opus, the Lotus Sutra. What's more, it doesn't say that he took over from his master in giving private consultation to disciples, but that he takes over in lecturing on a book. This is followed by a description of Zhiyi's master, Huisi. Zhizhou waited upon his master Nanyue Huisi, for Nanyue Huisi's virtuous cultivation was beyond conception or discussion. He exclusively recited texts for 10 years, practiced the repentance of the Vaipulya for 7 years, and constantly sat for 3 months, attaining perfect realization in an instant. He clearly penetrated and realized the Dharma gates of the great and lesser vehicle. So you'll remember that Master Huisi's own biography says the following. In his heart, Master Huisi thought to himself, saying, "I have upheld the Dharma Flower Sutra in the Dharma-ending age of Shakyamuni Buddha. I have now encountered the merciful honoured one, i.e. Maitreya Buddha, and have been moved to tears, for I have suddenly awakened." Now, without getting caught in the weeds of Tiantai exegesis, this sudden awakening experience as a result of personal practice on the Lotus Sutra is what Guanding is referring to when he mentions that Master Huisi attained perfect realization in an instant. Nevertheless, I hear the academic critic watching this video who retorts that I'm merely reading later exegesis into the text in order to justify my theory. For such critics, perhaps instead of taking my word for it, or even Guanding's, you might be more inclined to take Master Huisi's own words on the matter as gospel. Master Huisi himself says the following. The Dharma Flower Sutra is the sudden awakening of the Mahayana. It is the spontaneous realization without a teacher. It is the swift attainment of the way of the Buddhas, and it is the Dharma gate which all the world find difficult to believe. Putting Master Huisi's words next to Master Guanding's description in the Mohajirguan introduction gives us the following. When we see Master Guanding saying that Master Huisi attained perfect realization in an instant, and then compare it with what Master Huisi himself says about this sutra, we see him referring directly to the Lotus Sutra as the sudden awakening of the Mahayana. It is the Lotus Sutra then which caused his instantaneous realization. To make absolutely clear that it is the text of the Lotus Sutra itself and not his teachers which has caused this awakening, Master Huesa goes a step further and says emphatically that this Lotus Sutra is the spontaneous realization without a teacher. It therefore could not have come from a teacher or a master. Rather, it comes from the text of the Lotus Sutra. In short, Master Huesa's reliance is a text as well, and this is beyond any reasonable argument to the contrary when you compare the wording. Guanding clearly intends for us to understand it in this way. This means that so far, we were only introduced to Master Zhiyi himself in order to contextualize the Book of the Mohe Zhiguan, which constitutes his magnum opus. We were then told that Master Zhiyi attained awakening by means of a book, specifically the Buddha's own magnum opus, the Lotus Sutra. And now, Master Huesa is then also said to have attained awakening via this same book of the Lotus Sutra. I hope you're starting to see the booky pattern that's going on here. But if I'm right, of course, in my supposition that books are playing a very important role in this discussion of lineage, and that this is what Guanding wants us to focus on, then we should expect to see Guanding's description of the last master on this line of transmission having another booky connection. After all, if Guanding doesn't set up a book relationship for Master Huiwen, then I'm perhaps wrong in my suggestion, and I'm therefore just as guilty of causing violence to the text as those I chided earlier. But of course you already know that this is in fact what Guanding says about Master Huiwen. That is, that he relied exclusively on the Mahaprajnaparamita Upadesha, which is a treatise, i.e. a book, expounded by Nagarjuna. If any of you were hoping that you might finally see me getting violent with a book, I'm afraid to say you're out of luck. That is never, ever going to happen. And if you learn nothing from this video, save that books are to be treated with respect, then the hours of my life poured into making this video will not have been in vain. So Zhiyi is mentioned only to make sense of his book, the Mohe Zhiguan. Zhiyi's awakening is attributed to a book, the Lotus Sutra. Master Huesa's own awakening is attributed to this same book, the Lotus Sutra, and now Master Huiwen's realization is being described as a result of exclusive reliance on Nagarjuna's book, the Mahaprajnaparamita Upadesha. Now, scholarship usually places the great Nagarjuna on this list constituting the transmission from a present master, because of his mention here in regards to Master Huiwen and Zhiyi. But is Nagarjuna a present master here per se? Or just like Zhiyi at the beginning of our discussion, is the person of Nagarjuna only mentioned to make sense of the book he wrote, i.e. the Mahaprajnaparamita Upadesha? In fact, when Guanding refers to Nagarjuna here, he makes explicit that he is not on this transmission from a present master, but rather that he is the 13th master in the transmission of the treasury of the Dharma, which is another name for the transmission from the Golden Mouth. If scholarship is going to be consistent on this matter then, the Lotus Sutra is alluded to for two of these masters, as well as the golden-lettered Prajnaparamita Sutra for Zhiyi himself. Why then have they not included the Shakyamuni as well on this list? After stating that Master Huiwen relied exclusively on Nagarjuna's text, the Mahaprajnaparamita Upadesha, we're told that Master Zhiyi also relies on Nagarjuna, for Guanding says, and in his treatise on contemplation of thought, Zhizhou says, I take refuge in Master Nagarjuna. From this we know that Nagarjuna is the supreme patriarch of our school. But we now know that when a person is mentioned here in Guanding's introduction, it is in relation to their book, and in fact, Guanding is pulling this quote from another of Zhiyi's books. Guanding has already told us that Master Juyi lectured on the golden-lettered Prajnaparamita Sutra, and considering that Nagarjuna's Mahaprajnaparamita Upadesha is a commentary on this very sutra, the Panchavimshati, it all tracks rather well. I have been repeatedly claiming that individuals are only mentioned in Master Guanding's introduction to the Moha Zhiguan in order to establish the text written by them and through which awakening is realized. Juyi is mentioned only to legitimize his book, the Moha Zhiguan. The Buddha himself is mentioned only to legitimize his book, the Lotus Sutra. And Nagarjuna is mentioned only to legitimize his book, the Mahaprajnaparamita Upadesha. In short, I am claiming unambiguously the following two things. 1. That the only reason Master Guanding mentions the first lineage known as the transmission from the Golden Mouth at all is to legitimize the books of the Lotus Sutra and the Mahaprajnaparamita Upadesha, which are authored by members of it. The only reason Master Guanding must show that this first lineage of transmission ends with the execution of Master Simha and does not continue mouth to mouth down to the second line, called the transmission from a present master, is precisely to show that the transmission is happening via texts or books, not via masters. But how do you know that this isn't just my quirky, unusual reading of all of this? Once again, don't take my word for it. Take Master Janran's instead. Herein, it first explains the patriarchal line which transmitted the Dharma as the progressive foundation. If it did not first identify the great sage of the Tathagata, i.e. Shakyamuni Buddha, there would be no basis on which to delineate the 23 patriarchs. And if there were no delineation of the 23 patriarchs, then there would be no basis on which to identify the 13th patriarch, i.e. Nagarjuna. And if there were no identification of the 13th patriarch, then there would be no basis for believing in Hengya Huiwen, Tiantai Zhiyi, and Nanyue Huise. And this is why Guanding first analogizes the basis as being akin to seeking the font of a stream, or searching for the root cause of ascent. This treatise on calming and contemplation is offered up to those of the semblance and dharma-ending ages, and is akin to the stream or akin to the scent. Conversely, the Brahma sound from the golden mouth of the Buddha himself is akin to the font of the stream and akin to the root cause of the scent. And it's at this point, with your concentration waning, that you might be wondering why Master Guanding wants to do all of this. But if we think about it for any serious length of time, it all becomes quite clear, and very quickly, all of the scholarly confusion surrounding this lineage statement and Guanding's purpose disappears. Remember that Guanding has already told us. In this treatise on calming and contemplation, Tiantai Zhizhe, i.e. Zhiyi, expounds the Dharma gate which he cultivated in his own mind. Master Zhiyi may have now passed away, and we cannot, as it were, study with him face to face. But this text of the Moha Zhiguan is nothing less than the way that Master Zhiyi himself practiced. It isn't his skillful dispensation for a particular audience. It isn't a small portion of Master Zhiyi's instruction. It is the Buddha-Dharma as Master Zhiyi understood it and he himself cultivated it. It is the whole picture of his instruction. It is the crux or fulcrum around which all other descriptions of the path are to be measured. With this text of the Moha Zhiguan in your hands, it's therefore exactly the same as having Master Zhiyi sitting face to face with you, instructing you personally. What else are we waiting for? Though in the mundane sense, I cannot see Shakyamuni Buddha sitting next to me, when I have the text of his Lotus Sutra in my hands, then I sit together with the Shakyamuni in a way that is no different to me sitting in front of him on Vulture Peak. And though I live too late to sit across from the great Bodhisattva Nagarjuna with his magnum opus, the Mahaprajnaparamita Upadesha, by my side, I stand with this great sage arm in arm. Like Huesa, though I've not seen their faces, I've already discerned their minds. And though I've not sat in front of them in the flesh, with their works in my heart, how can you say that they are not my personal teachers? After Master Ji's passing into nirvana, the vacuum left by his absence must have been felt acutely and incredibly deeply by his community. And in the absence of the great master, his magnum opus, this Moha Drugwan, became, like the Lotus Sutra and the Mahaprajnaparamita Upadesha before it, a crucial part of the transmission and lineage of our school. This is why Dengyo Daishi Saicho, who founded our Japanese branch of Tendai, instituted that the Moha Drugwan would be the text for those specializing in the Tiantai core of our tradition, because this is the lineage in a substantive sense. He writes, 2 individuals shall study Tendai. One person will be made to learn the Mahavairochana Bodhi Sutra, i.e. Mikyo focused, and one person will be made to learn the Moha Drugwan, i.e. the Tiantai focused. Once again, don't take my word for it, Janran explains it far better than I. The expression expounds the Dharmagate which he cultivated in his own mind means that Zhang'an Guanding received these practices from the great Master Zhi in private consultation, and therefore this specific practice clearly expresses that which he transmitted. If the transmission were not cultivation, then it would merely be words without deeds. If this were the case, how could one demonstrate that what was transmitted was not ineffectual? Therefore we know that what he transmitted here is what he practiced. And furthermore, should future generations cultivate in a manner that is not contrary to these words, then both of their respective practices will be of one kind. There are others who say, outside of Zhi's 3 works on calming and contemplation, there is a separate transmission of the essentials of mind, and so the texts of these 3 works are thus useless. But even if one possesses the words of oral transmission from personal instruction, this could be nothing more than verification of one's personal capacity by a teacher. The contemplative methods of pacifying the mind in this text are sufficient. How much more so is this the case for later generations of students who do not receive personal instruction, for without this text, what could be said anyway? Therefore, you should trust that this text is identical to that which is transmitted, and this is why Master Zhi said in his final instructions, calming and contemplation does not require oral transmission, for I expounded it for others at the time of your personal record. The meaning of personal record indicates that it is that which Zhang'an Guanding himself recorded in these 10 fascicles. The implication of this instruction is that, strictly speaking, the content of personal instruction is often incomplete, whereas that which is said in this personal record of Guanding is complete. Therefore, know that the great master transmitted calming and contemplation, and personal instruction based on individual capacities is not something on which future generations can rely. For this reason, at the end of his life, he was very careful about his final instructions. Through examination, we realize that this discussion of separate oral transmissions is wrong. So Janran tells us that this Moha Drugwan outlines precisely what Zhi cultivated, and what is transmitted is always the cultivation, because it alone can be verified by its transformative power. When we receive in-person instruction from a teacher, this usually entails adaptation by the teacher for the sake of the student. A teacher knows his student and therefore tempers his message based on what he thinks is beneficial for them. This means that a teacher's instruction can never be the full message, but rather is a skillful dispensation of a part of the message. The content of the Lotus Sutra, on the other hand, is the Shakyamuni's message devoid of skillful means, pure and perfect in scope, because in it the Buddha tells us the following: Now I, happily and without fear, amidst all the bodhisattvas, preach directly and discarding skillful means, preach solely the unsurpassed path. The content of Nagarjuna's Mahaprajnaparamita Upadesha is the path as he himself understood it, because he tells us the following: In truth, all of these 3 knowledges are attained in a single moment. It is because we here intend that beings have faith in the Prajnaparamita that we instead sequentially expound them separately. It is because we intend to cause sentient beings to attain purity of mind that we therefore expound them like this. And the Moha Drugwan is Master Zhiyi's cultivation as he practiced it in his own mind. For as Guanding told us in this treatise on calming and contemplation, Tiantai Zhizhe, i.e. Zhiyi, expounds the Dharma gate which he cultivated in his own mind. Now, a very important disclaimer must be said here. This in no way, shape or form is a denial of the usefulness or the necessity of an in-person teacher. I'm going to say that again because I have no doubt that someone will watch this video and intentionally misunderstand what is being said. This in no way, shape or form is a denial of the usefulness or necessity of an in-person teacher. Zhiyi, Guanding, Zhanran, and all legitimate Tiantai and Tendai teachers acknowledge the need for in-person guidance. But in a meaningful way, in-person guidance is guidance only if it helps me to understand what has been transmitted and bequeathed in the written record. If I approach a teacher and his guidance helps me to understand what the Buddha has bequeathed to us, then his guidance verifies the written transmission. But if on the other hand, he says something totally different and claims that this is a special oral transmission outside of the text, he is to be rejected. If he does violence to the written transmission, he is not a message of the Buddha. Master Huisa's response to Zhiyi, after the latter had had an awakening experience, puts it quite well. When Zhiyi told him about his experience, Master Huisa replied as follows. If it were not you, this would not have been experienced. If it were not me, this would not have been confirmed. In other words, my job as a teacher is just to confirm and guide. Master Huisa understood this, as all good teachers do. On first meeting Master Zhiyi, Master Huisa made their relationship abundantly clear. He said the following. In days of yore at Vulture Peak, we together heard the Dharma Flower Sutra, i.e. the Lotus Sutra, expounded, and drawn by the conditions of previous lives, you have now returned. If you're familiar with the Lotus Sutra, you'll probably have noticed that this is an allusion to the following passage in chapter 2. Only a Buddha together with a Buddha is able to fully fathom the true characteristic of all dharmas. A teacher doesn't give you a special magical oral transmission that answers all of your questions. He guides you like an equal. Why? Because it is only among equals, only among a Buddha together with a Buddha that the Dharma is made manifest. Before the written testament of the Buddhas, teacher and student are both equal in that they're both equally held accountable against that written record. Even in esoteric practice, which absolutely requires, in no uncertain terms, an in-person teacher's instruction, this is still guidance. Why? Because if it leads you away from what the Dharmakaya has already instructed, it is not guidance. The Master Yuanzhao summarizes this nicely when he describes what Master Zhiyi knew from the Lotus Sutra itself and what he learned from Master Huisa in person. He says the following. That which great Master Tiantai Zhiyi received in person on Vulture Peak was the transmission of calming and contemplation. His sublime awakening on Mount Dasu was the realization of this calming and contemplation. The content of a master's written magnum opus is the basis, and the present master's instruction is guidance held accountable by that written record. It brings forth the meaning of the text, like the blue that is extracted from the indigo plant. And that's just a small tidbit for those who know. Before moving on, it is important that we discuss the enormous elephant in the room. If you've had any experience with the Chan or Zen school,
You might have noticed that while the Tiantai Tendai School ends the first lineage that Guanding explained with the execution of the 23rd member, an Indian named Simha, the Chan or Zen school, by contrast, teaches that Master Simha did manage to transmit the Dharma to a disciple. And this lineage then extends another 3 members to arrive at the Indian founder of the Chan or Zen school, i.e. the monastic named Bodhidharma. It was particularly concerning for the Chan or Zen tradition that the lineage from the Buddha might have been severed at some point, precisely because of the distinct nature of the Chan or Zen tradition's understanding of lineage. Unlike the Tiantai Tendai tradition that we've been discussing, wherein the text is the transmission, the Chan or Zen tradition's unique quality is that their tradition is understood to represent a separate transmission outside of the doctrines and not established on words and letters. Now, without going too far beyond our present discussion, this is fundamentally a claim for the preeminence of direct experience and in-person transmission over and above scriptural or textual transmission. This is what is being referred to by this statement that it is not established on words or letters. This tradition, therefore, identifies its own lineage as a simple transmission which does not rely on the scriptures, and in the words of the Lankavatara Sutra, does not descend into words and letters. And it's quite hard to look at the Tiantai Tendai and the Chan or Zen lineage statements and not conclude that these are, in fact, opposite claims about the transmission of Buddha-Dharma. The reason, therefore, that the Chan or Zen school had to hold to the idea that Master Simha had a Dharma heir and that an unbroken lineage stretched from him down to Bodhidharma is because if their transmission is not based on text, but is rather a wordless mind-to-mind transmission, then there cannot be any breaks in that line without a loss of this mind-to-mind transmission. Needless to say, Chan and Zen masters tried numerous different strategies to deny the implications of the account in the record of the conditions for the transmission of the Dharma treasury, which is the text that Guanding was relying on. Indeed, it's very possible that Master Janran was speaking about a very real group of people when he shuts down a hypothetical opponent claiming an oral transmission that makes texts useless, in that quote that we looked at above. Now, debate between the two schools on this matter was intense, and it probably reached its height with the Chan patriarch Mingzhao Qisong, who lived between 1007 and 1072. This patriarch of the Chan school, Qisong, remarked that the source used by the Tiantai Tendai school should be burnt. He says, "Without hesitation, I say that this deceptive text can be burnt. This is none other than the record of the transmission of the Dharma treasury." Now, luckily, the Tiantai Tendai tradition was a little bit more conciliatory and optimistic in regards to this disagreement, because we see the Tiantai monk Zhipan saying the following in his record of the transmission of the Buddha and patriarchs. Our Tiantai school claims that the patriarchal transmission ceased with Simha, but the Chan tradition adds 4 other individuals to this. On these grounds, we have quarrelled with each other across the generations without cease. If one makes use of the broader idea to settle this question, then there are no issues. That is to say, although Simha met with persecution, this does not mean that he did not have a disciple to whom he was able to transmit the Dharma. It is merely that they are not to be counted among the formally recorded transmission of the Golden Mouth. Consequently, 4 individuals can be added to this in order to reach Bodhidharma and the initial arrival of this transmission in the eastern lands, constituting the 28 persons of the Chan lineage. What harm could there be in this? If Chan practitioners seek the truth in this matter, then they should merely state that these 4 individuals transmitted the Dharma to each other, passing this to Bodhidharma, and this would be acceptable. But now they even feloniously pull justification from the Dhyana Sutra of Dharmatrata to prove that this is not true. The Chan master Qisong Mingjiao compiled the genealogy of establishing the patriarchs, claiming that the Dhyana Sutra includes 28 patriarchs. When we now examine this sutra, however, we see that it only lays out 9 individuals, and many of the names are not the same. And so the Dharma master Zifang justifiably composed the Halting Lies treatise in order to rebuke this. In other words, Tiantai Tendai can accept that there was a person-to-person transmission, but given the textual evidence saying that the transmission of the Golden Mouth ended with Simha, then the masters from that point onwards must be distinguished from those former links in some fashion. In any case, whichever side of the issue we find ourselves on, it's useful to compare the two lineages to get a sense of what is fundamentally important to the Tiantai Tendai transmission on the one hand and the Chan Zen transmission on the other. The Tiantai Tendai transmission requires a lineage statement that is broken, discontinuous, in order to show that text is performing the transmission and bridges that gap rather than masters. And the latter Chan or Zen transmission requires a lineage statement that is unbroken in order to show that a mind-to-mind transmission is the mode of lineage. So you now know why the Tiantai Tendai School posits this split lineage, and you therefore know that the written record of the teachings is understood to represent the unadulterated element of the transmission. You further know that the Lotus Sutra, the Mahaprajnaparamita Upadesha, and Zhiyi's Moha are the crucial texts representative of this transmission. Putting this all together, we get the following. So the Tendai Hokkeshu lineage begins, of course, with the Shakyamuni Buddha who truly awakened in the distant past and who sat within the stupa of Prabhutaratna Buddha. This message of Shakyamuni Buddha was preserved without skillful means in the Lotus Sutra, which stands as the magnum opus of the Shakyamuni Buddha. The Bodhisattva Nagarjuna represents the best of the Mahayana after the Shakyamuni's passing, and his message and understanding was transmitted in unadulterated form in his magnum opus, the Mahaprajnaparamita Upadesha. Following on from this, we have the following. The Chinese master Qi Gao Chanshi Huiwen used those texts and passed his understanding on to his disciple Nanyue Chanshi Huisi. Nanyue Chanshi Huisi transmitted his understanding to his disciple Tiantai Dashi Zhiyi. And Tiantai Dashi Zhiyi gives the lectures which would be recorded as the Moha Zhiguan that we've been discussing, or the Great Coming and Contemplation. After Master Zhiyi's passing, the next phase of our lineage passes through the writer of the introduction we've been discussing, that is, Master Guanding. So Zhiyi passes the transmission onto his disciple Jiang'an Dashi Guanding, and Jiang'an Dashi Guanding transmits it to his disciple Fahua Chanshi Zhiwei. Zhiwei transmits it to his disciple Tiangong Chanshi Huiwei, and Huiwei transmits it to his disciple Zuoxi Chanshi Xuanlang. Now Xuanlang is the master of the very famous and illustrious master Miaola Dashi Zhanran. So he transmits that Dharma to his disciple Zhanran. Now before we move any further, I just want to make a very short note for our Nichiren Shoshu friends who might be watching this video. Miaola Dashi Zhanran is the individual that you'll see mentioned in Nichiren's writings. In the current English translations, you'll see his name rendered as Miao Lo. So many people in the Nichiren Shoshu community assume that this is an alternative name. It's not. It's just an old rendering in Wade Giles' transliteration for the name Miaola. Miaola is Miaolo. It shouldn't be pronounced Miaolo, it should be pronounced Miaola. It would be the closest in English, not taking into account the tonality of Chinese. So Miaola Dashi Zhanran is of course a very famous master within our lineage, and he of course transmits it to his disciples. So when we get to the disciples of Master Zhanran, there are two disciples who are very important for our Japanese Tendai, because our founder Dengyo Daishi Saicho would train under two of Master Zhanran's disciples. These two disciples are as follows. The first is Master Langya Heshang Dao Sui. So that's Dao Sui. The other disciple of Master Zhanran that Saicho trains with is Gusu Hershang Xingman. So Dengyo Daishi Saicho travels to Mount Tiantai and trains under masters Dao Sui and Xingman, both of whom are disciples of the illustrious Tiantai master Miaola Dashi Janran. Our Japanese founder Dengyo Daishi Saicho trained with these masters at Mount Tiantai, but he was not alone. Saicho travelled with his own disciple Gishin. So Master Dao Sui, in addition to Saicho and Gishin, also has a Chinese disciple named Guangxiu. And it's from this Chinese disciple Guangxiu that later Chinese Tiantai is descended. So, among the disciples of Dao Sui and Xingman, the three important links that we need to be aware of are Dengyo Daishi Saicho, the founder of Japanese Tendai, Daiichi Gishin, who was Saicho's disciple, who also travelled to Mount Tiantai with him, and after Saicho's death became the first zasu, or first prelate of the Tendai School. And finally, the third disciple we need to be aware of is the Chinese disciple Zhixing Dashi Guangxiu, and he is, of course, the ancestor of later Chinese Tiantai. So, Saicho shows his understanding of that textual relationship occurring within the Tiantai lineage, because although he sets the Mohe Zhiguan and of course Guanding's lineage statement in it as the textbook for Japanese Tendai, in his summary of the Tiantai lineage in his Naisho Buppo Kechimyakufu, Saicho lays out the transmission from the Golden Mouth all the way up to the 13th link Nagarjuna, but then he jumps and names the Indian master Surya Soma. Now Surya Soma was the individual who converted Master Kumarajiva to the Mahayana in Yarkand, an oasis city on the southern route of the Tarim Basin, or Taklamakan Desert. This line of transmission then of course passes through Surya Soma to his disciple Kumarajiva himself. And this is the head nod to that textual relationship, because of course Kumarajiva is the translator of the Buddha's magnum opus, the Lotus Sutra, as well as Nagarjuna's magnum opus, the Mahaprajna Paramita Upadesha. And Saicho shows that he understands this by including Kumarajiva in the lineage, and then actually lists those two translations as part of the lineage. This is then passed to Fu Dashi, or Fu Xi, of the Shuanglingsi temple. And this once again shows that Saicho affirms the role of texts in the transmission, because Fu Dashi was the first compiler of the Chinese Buddhist canon after Kumarajiva's translations had appeared. If this doesn't show that Master Saicho understood the role of text within this transmission, then I'm not sure what would. Once again, this is an issue that contemporary scholars seem to chase their tail over. They run themselves in endless loops trying to figure out why Saicho's description doesn't match Guanding's. But if they understood the role of text in both, then they wouldn't be confused by this. This is not Saicho's creative reinterpreting of the lineage set out by Master Guanding. That's nonsense. Remember that Saicho has by this point already made the Mohe Zhiguan his textbook. So he knows that that lineage statement and the one that he writes in his Kechimyakufu will both be studied by his students. We've also of course seen that Master Zhiyi journeyed from Mount Daxian to Mount Dasu, where he placed himself under the tutelage of the famous meditation master and Lotus Sutra specialist, Master Huisi. Now, of his teachers, Zhiyi would come to consider Huisi uniquely as his true master, and it's quite clear that their karmic connection had formed long before the present life. Master Huisi was equally taken by his disciple, because after meeting for the first time, we're told that he exclaimed the following: "In days of yore at Vulture Peak, we together heard the Dharmaflower Sutra expounded, and drawn by the conditions of previous lives, you have now returned." Now this is understood to be literal, based on the fact that the Lotus Sutra itself implies that anyone who hears this teaching now had heard this teaching in the past, been caused to forget this and was now being brought back and reminded of this teaching. This whole structure is based on a section from chapter 3 where we read the following. Thereupon the Buddha told Shariputra, presently in the midst of this great assembly of God's men, Shramanas and Brahmins, I preach that in the past, in the presence of 120,000 Buddhas, for the sake of the unsurpassed way, I constantly taught and transformed you, so that during the long night you would also follow me and accept my teachings. Because I guided you by means of skillful means, you have been born now into my Dharma. Shariputra, in the past I taught you to aspire after the Buddha way, but now you have forgotten all of this, and so you say of yourself that you've already attained the extinction of liberation. It is because I now desire to cause you to return to the cultivation of your original vow, that for the sake of all the Shravakas I preach this great vehicle sutra, known as the lotus flower of the sublime Dharma, which is the Dharma for instructing bodhisattvas, and that which is protected and kept in mind by the Buddhas. For this reason, in his Naisho Buppo Kechimyakufu, Saicho refers to both Masters Huisi and Zhiyi as Nanyedasha Huisi of the Chen dynasty from the audience of Mount Gudrakuta in India, and Tiantai Dashi Zhizhe of the Sui dynasty from the audience of Mount Gudrakuta in India. During Dengyo Daishi Saicho's time in China, although his primary aim was to receive this Chinese Tiantai lineage that we've been discussing, he also received a number of other lineages which make up important components of our Tendai tradition. All of Master Saicho's lineages are recorded in his Naisho Buppo Kechimyakufu, and there are two lineages which are grouped together and referred to as the Bodhidharma lineages. The first of these two lineages was the one passed to Saicho by Master Dento Hoshi Gyohyo. Now, Dento Hoshi Gyohyo was Saicho's original teacher in Japan before he travelled to China, and it's worth noting that Gyohyo was not a Chan or Zen monk per se. The second of these two lineages was transmitted to Saicho by Master Xiaozhan, and this represents the Niu Tou Chan, or the Ox Head Northern Chan or Zen transmission. In practical terms, there are no practices or doctrines commonly utilized in Tendai today which derive directly from either Master Gyohyo or Master Xiaozhan, but these lineages are included in Master Saicho's transmissions because they provide evidence for Saicho's direct connection with the Buddha. In other words, these transmissions do for Saicho what Zhiyi's biography did for him, i.e. show legitimacy as an heir of the Buddha in an unbroken chain, even though there is of course this broken or textual lineage in play. One of Master Dengyo Daishi Saicho's most far-reaching reforms on returning to Japan was his insistence that Japanese Tendai monks be ordained using the Bodhisattva precepts of the Brahmajala Sutra. He received these precepts himself from one of his Tiantai masters, specifically Master Daosui. However, due to the significant role that these precepts play in Japanese Tendai, essentially acting as our ordination lineage, they're recorded as a separate line of transmission in Saicho's Naisho Buppo Kechimyakufu. This lineage, of course, begins with the Vairochana Buddha atop the shining sun of the lion throne in the world of the lotus flower platform treasury. This passes to the myriad Shakyamuni Buddha emanations, then to the Bodhisattva Ajita, which is another name for Maitreya. It then passes through a line of approximately 20-odd Bodhisattvas until it gets to the Tripitaka-acharya Kumarajiva, who naturally translates the text and therefore comes down to Master Huisi, who transmits those precepts to Master Zhiyi. And finally, the last three lineages in Saicho's Naisho Bukbo Kechimyakufu are the Mikkyo, or esoteric lineages. Specifically, these are the lineage of the Karpa Dhatu Mandala, the lineage of the Vajra Dhatu Mandala, and the lineage of mixed esoteric mandalas. Now, because we live, unfortunately, in times where unscrupulous folk on the internet will view videos like this and take advantage of others by fabricating claims about themselves, I will not be outlaying the lineages in an unbroken fashion as I have done thus far. Nevertheless, in brief, of course, the lineage of the Karpa Dhatu starts with the Mahavairochana, the Dharmakaya, and it is the Acharya Shunxiao who passes that lineage on to Dengyo Naishi Saicho, our founder in Japan. The next lineage, that is the lineage of the Vajradhatu Mandala, of course again starts with the Mahavairochana, the Dharmakaya, and is also transmitted to Saicho via the Acharya Shunxiao. Lastly, the lineage of mixed esoteric mandalas, is those esoteric practices which were part of the broader esoteric type within Chinese Mahayana Buddhism. Now, this lineage passes from the Shakyamuni and was passed to Master Saicho from the Venerable Weixiang at the Guoqingsi Temple on Mount Tiantai. Now, given that Master Saicho's primary aim in travelling to China was to receive certification in the Chinese Tiantai School, he did not spend sufficient time with esoteric masters to have received the full esoteric transmission. And as a result of this, the Tendai esoteric lineages were therefore further supplemented by the next generation of Tendai masters, namely the great Jikaku Daishi Enin and the great Chisho Daishi Enchin. Enin was a direct disciple of Saicho, while Enin was the direct disciple of Master Gishin, who we also saw travelled to China with Master Saicho. While Master Enin is therefore popularly known and thought of in terms of esoteric practice, it's important to know that Saicho personally transmitted to him the Tiantai lineage, for in Enin's biography we read the following. In order to spread the transmission of the Dharma, the late Master Saicho chose 10 young and intelligent individuals from his disciples and had them study the Moho-Zhiguan. Day and night Enin diligently studied it, and when he completed a fascicle, he would ascend the high seat and lecture upon it, until he finished all 10 fascicles. In the same way, if there were individuals who came and desired to study the Moho-Zhiguan, Saicho would have the great Master Enin discourse on it for them, and the late Master Saicho would personally confirm his exposition. In this way, over many years, he repeatedly studied the one vehicle and expounded upon our school. And for this, the late Master Saicho would regularly praise him. Now, without knowledge regarding the role of text within the Tiantai lineage, and in particular the role of Zhiyi's Moho-Zhiguan, these remarks would merely seem as if Enin studied this work with Saicho. However, you now know better than that, and you can see in this the implication that Enin received the Tiantai lineage from Saicho via the text of the Moho-Zhiguan. And also, as we've seen before, we see here in Enin's biography the student Enin lecturing on the text in the place of his teacher Saicho, just as Zhiyi did in Huisa's place in the introduction to the Moho-Zhiguan. And of course, in this interplay, the role of the teacher, in this case Saicho, is merely to confirm and guide that reading. Both Enin and Enchin travelled to China in order to receive esoteric initiations and complete the esoteric program which Saicho had laid the groundwork for. For example, Enin studied Sanskrit, specifically in the Siddham script, with Zhongrui at the Kaiyuansi temple in circa 838 AD, and then again with the South Indian monk Ratnachandra in 842 AD. He also received ritual instruction and initiation to the Vajradhatu Mandala from Master Chuanya at the Songshan Yuan Temple in 839 AD. At the Xingshansa temple in 840 AD, he would practice the Vajradhatu mandala rite again and receive the consecration or abhisheka of the 5 vases from Master Yuanzhang. Finally, Enin would receive the transmission of the Garbhadhatu mandala from Master Fa Chuan at the Xuanfasa temple in 842 AD. Master Enchin, on the other hand, was the nephew of Kobo Daishi Kukai, the illustrious founder of the Shingon school, and he too, as we said, would travel to China to acquire various esoteric transmissions. Once again though, although he's popularly associated with esoteric training, he travelled to Mount Tiantai itself, and in fact he built a hall there known as the Shikando, or the Hall of Calming and Contemplation. And this hall was designed to house Tendai monks from Japan who might come and train at Mount Tiantai. Now again, the fact that it is named the Hall of Calming and Contemplation, i.e. of the Moho-Zhiguan, is significant here and represents the fact that Chisho Daishi Enchin was also of course concerned with maintaining the Lotus Sutra lineage via the Chinese Tiantai School. Now Master Enchin would receive both mandala rites as well as a work called the Gobushinkan, or the Essential Contemplations on the 5 families of the Vajradhatu mandala, from Master Fa Chuan. At the Da Xingshan temple in 855, he would then receive guidance on the 2 mandalas with the Indian monks Pradnatra and Pradnachakra. These lineages, representing the golden age of Chinese Buddhism during the Tang dynasty, have been nurtured and transmitted in Japan down to the present. In my own case, the teachings and practices I have received from my late master, the Archbishop Ara Ryokan, are of the Kangeji line, established by Jigen Daishi Tenkai, and this line is itself derived from the Sanmon lineage established by Master Saicho's disciple, Jikaku Daishi Enin. I hope that you now know what Master Guanding is doing in his lineage statement in the Moho-Zhiguan. I also hope that you are sufficiently aware of the role of text in the transmission of Buddha-Dharma. At the minimum, you're in the position to be able to reflect critically on the nature of transmission and see the interplay between text and in-person instruction. At most, you've been introduced to the forebears and sources of the Tiantai Tendai school, those sources and forebears which Guanding hoped you might keep in mind. Scholarship must not do violence to the text it aims to explain, and any theory which violates the text in a substantial way is to be rejected therefore. What's more, if scholarship intends to explain a text in a manner which is distinct from the traditional exegesis, it enters into conversation with that exegesis by default. It should therefore explain why it has decided to discount that traditional explanation. Religious practitioners, on the other hand, require the guidance of a teacher, but both the teacher and the student are beholden to the written testament of the Buddhas and the patriarchs. When they, i.e. the students, approach their in-person teacher, their measuring stick for evaluating said teacher is that written testament. And for this reason, the student is obligated to familiarize themselves with the text bequeathed to them as best as they can. Thank you for sticking with me, and if you like our content, please subscribe and share it where it will be of use. If you like what we do, please see our other material here or on our website, or consider supporting us so that we can get this material out there for folks. This has been Jikai Dehn of the Enmitsuji Tendai Temple, helping you to become the potent advocate for Dharma that the Buddha calls us to be. This video is dedicated to the memory of Master Ara Ryokan. Namu Muryo Kongo En Daisoujo Ryokan Dai Kasho. Thanks very much.